Hi, I'm Greg Golden,
And I'm Sam Lubell,
and we're the authors of the Phaidon Atlas of Never-Built Architecture.
and Concrete Architecture. And you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. We start today in Miami with architect and author Chad Oppenheim. Then it's off to Long Beach, California, and architect Alan Pullman. We'll stop in New Canaan, Connecticut, and visit with author David Peterson, and then we swoon again with returning musical guest Halie Loren with beautiful songs from her new album. And now, your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. The mid-century modernist movement, depending on which author or academic you talk to, started somewhere between 1915 and 1935. We don't have to agree on a date, but one thing's for sure, all these seminal architects of that time are, well, dead. And what's more, the immediate employees, followers, disciples, the architects that took early modernism to its zenith in the 50s and 60s, are almost all gone too. The men and women of that era are now in their late 80s or early 90s. A special breed, they conjured a future of buildings that landed gently on earth, with clean lines, geometric shapes, a wonderfully calming scale, and a legacy that we all want to preserve. If you know someone like this in your town, get on the phone right now and call them up for an interview. Trust me, if you don't do it, no one else will, and these memories will be lost forever. These architects are walking, talking encyclopedias who have witnessed the evolution of architecture from classical to Zaha. As for an interview, they will rarely say no. I've interviewed over 100 architects in their 80s and 90s, and they love to talk about their work and the people they've admired. But you might be worried, is your person a bit, say, a little out of it? Well, I've interviewed people who can't recall their daughter's name, but if you ask which clients pissed them off in the 1980s, suddenly their memory comes back, very sharp, and it can go on for hours. Do you have a cell phone? Of course you do. There's a recording app on there, and if not, they're easy to download. By creating oral histories, we're not just honoring these architects, we ensure that their legacy lives on. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Chad Oppenheim graduated from Cornell University.
Go Big Red!
And in 1999, he founded Oppenheim Architecture. His catchy slogan is, "Design follows life and form follows feeling." I like that. Oppenheim has taught at Cornell and Harvard and is the author of 2 books, Spirit of Place, about 7 of his award-winning projects, and Lair, Radical Homes and Hideouts of Movie Villains.
Whoa.
Because you're not a true evildoer without an awesome modernist house. Here's George's conversation with Chad Oppenheim.
Chad, before we get started about architecture, when I was looking through your Instagram feed, I found a really interesting photo of you. You're on a beach, you're looking out at the ocean, but you're standing in a front-end loader. What was that all about?
Yeah, so we were just exploring the site from a little elevated angle to see what we would find when we lifted the house a bit. So, we do anything to find the right position and location for a house. So that was fun. The client loves to play around with that type of equipment, and I jumped in there and he gave me a ride.
And you've had other clients who've had equipment too.
Yes, I see there's a little bit of a trend with some successful businessmen who use these toys, if you will, these full-size Tonka toys to relax and move earth around. So it's pretty funny. It just happened the other day.
And I guess you get to see how the house is going to look and how it's going to feel by getting up in the air. That's the whole idea.
Yes, yes. We were looking to check out a different aspect, where to put the ground floor.
Now, one of your other clients, I understand, was Karl Lagerfeld, who died recently.
Yes, we got to work with Carl on a really interesting project, and he was absolutely amazing.
What kind of project was it?
It was a project in the Middle East where he was kind of curating the development. It was called Isla Moda. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. It was in the world, that large project that was carved out or sprayed onto the sea floor. But, the highlight of that was really spending time with Carl. He was one of the most incredible people I've ever met, and incredibly brilliant, and just an incredible sweetheart too. Surprisingly, not as you would imagine from his persona.
Right. I mean, I always kind of imagined him as a more high-end Larry David, kind of cranky all the time.
Yeah, I mean, he was just pretty high-end Larry David. That's funny. Yeah, he was just incredibly profound, and I mean, just so intelligent and knowledgeable about everything. It was incredible experience to collaborate with him on this project.
You recently won the 2023 American Prize for Architecture, which is kind of like the Oscars. What is that all about?
Well, it's the oldest architectural institute in the United States. And every year they pick an architect who portrays the values of their organization, and turned out to be a much bigger deal than I had thought. I was incredibly honored, but then going there, it was an incredible fanfare. Actually, one of the things that blew me away was they had flown in a wreath that was woven from the trees from the foothills of the Acropolis, and they anointed me. So
you got like a wreath or something on your head?
Yeah, because like in ancient Greece and during the Renaissance, that's what they did to figures of the arts and humanities. They did that. So this has been a tradition of theirs for a very long time.
Now, where was this?
In Chicago. They're based in Chicago, right?
Okay.
Right. The home of the skyscraper, right? The birthplace of the skyscraper.
Right, sure.
So, and the speech that was given, like, almost brought me to tears. It was so amazing, and that was a really magical moment.
So do you get like the special ID card decoder ring now as part of the club?
Well, it is a good club to be in.
Yeah.
I have the wreath slowly decaying in my house, and then they gave me a silver wreath as well, and some other incredible paraphernalia.
Well, let's talk about your book, which came out a couple of years ago, called Lair: The Radical Homes and Hideouts of Movie Villains, which of course has been associated with certain modernist houses for decades, right?
Yes.
When did the modernist house actually become associated with the evil villain, the mastermind of the film?
Well, I think it's that they live differently, right? They are pushing the boundaries of the norm of domesticity, and they are kind of on the fringes of society, perhaps searching for a better existence, right? Like all of the villains, they're not just like evil, especially the James Bond villains. They have a mission, right? They're very mission based. And that architecture kind of speaks to their forward thinking. Not correct always, but
right.
They do have great taste typically in these layers, and they've always fascinated me since I was a little kid and have inspired me in my own work, consciously and subconsciously.
Did you look into layers that extended beyond houses? Like I know in some of the Bond films, there was like a moon base underground as well.
Yeah, that was in Moonraker. We didn't do Moonraker, but you could do a whole book purely on Bond, and we wanted to use other villains as well. But the one that really set me off, George, was that when I was a kid, somehow I was watching The Man with the Golden Gun. And Scalamandra, who was the villain, besides having 3 nipples and a flying car.
Yeah, with Hervé Villechaize as
Tattoo,
yes.
Yeah. Cute and scary at the same time.
I just saw that movie recently in Palm Springs for the first time, and it really does hold up.
Yeah, so that lair was really the kickoff to my fascination with these villain lairs. Scalamandra had this rock fortress carved out of these limestone islands in Thailand, and it really inspired me. Even in my own work now, we're doing a resort in Saudi Arabia that is carved into a rock. And certainly it started with Scalamandra.
I think Britt Eklund was in the trunk,
Yeah.
right? Flying around in the flying car.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And then she finally got loose, opened it up and looked out and was very concerned about being high. But, those Bond movies were really pivotal to my education, as was Star Wars and other films as well. And then, of course, Lautner, sort of the unsung hero of architecture. He was not someone we ever studied in school or were exposed to. And, he's become one of my biggest inspirations through the years.
What was the earliest film version of a villain lair that you found in your research?
Well, we did Dr. Strangelove, The War Room, which both of these films, the production designer was Ken Adam. And he did a lot of the Bond films, and he was inspired by Lautner, and Lautner was inspired by him. So it was kind of interesting because sometimes they filmed in a Lautner house, like Diamonds Are Forever, and other times they were filming in environments that were inspired by Lautner's inspiration of what Ken Adams has done. So it was a very interesting relationship and fascinating in terms of how architecture was used to help tell a story.
I know that the earliest house I could find was the fictional one in North by Northwest on top of Mount Rushmore.
The almost Frank Lloyd Wright house. Yeah, and that was fascinating because they originally wanted Hitchcock actually went to Frank Lloyd Wright and asked him to design the house for the movie, but he wanted too much money. So Hitchcock just kind of took what he wanted from his style and built the house. They were also trying to actually build it near Mount Rushmore where it was set, but they couldn't get the permits for that. So
I bet they couldn't. In the movie, it looks like that the house is sited on top of the heads
right
in Mount Rushmore, right? Which is kind of impossible. I mean, it's a federal piece of land.
Yes. But, Hitchcock was Hitchcock. So
yeah, exactly.
You
exactly.
never knew.
Now, not the villains, but the people with lots and lots of money these days are not building lairs necessarily, but they're building compounds. They're building things with great underground spaces and places for survival. I read a lot about the head of Facebook building a massive underground complex in Hawaii. Have you seen that trend?
We get to work with a lot of fascinating clients who have built incredible companies. And we started down a journey building an incredible bunker under one house in a exotic location. And then throughout the project, it just kept getting smaller and smaller and then ultimately disappeared. And the notion was that if there's an issue there, they're just going to be like airlifted out of that location from the helicopter on their yacht that was parked offshore. So it never came down to the fact that we were going to need that, because at one point we were designing that this thing could like survive for like weeks. And I'm like, if you're stuck in your bunker for weeks, you have bigger problems than having a gym down there and, an entertainment area. I used to think a lot about that, George, and, these bunkers and saving yourself. And I was just like, I don't know. Do you really want to be saved if there's total devastation outside? I've kind of, through my reading of a lot of interesting science fiction books, I wonder if I would actually really want to be the one like carrying the torch of civilization, or just be like, oh, that was fun. Let's move on.
That same year that you wrote Lair, you put out a book on your practice, Spirit of Place.
Mm-hmm.
Were those worked on concurrently? Because that's a lot of work to do two books at one time.
Yeah, I mean, they were kind of started at different times. I had the idea for the Lair book probably 30 years before, and it took me that long to kind of produce it. And then Spirit of Place was just a moment of like, hey, there's a group of projects that speak to the opportunities of what we can learn from where we're building and how we can create an architecture that is very much generated by the forces and energies and information that we find sometimes on the top of a earth mover.
Right, for sure.
So we're always searching. In a way, I almost kind of allude to the fact that we're like archaeologists. We're kind of, the truth is there. We're just uncovering it.
Yeah.
You know, we did this incredible villa for the movie director Michael Bay in Bel Air, and you know, he was like getting down to the ground and tasting the soil. And, you know, our work is derived from the site and the context. And, you know, that's why everything looks very different from wherever we're building. And I think that's what makes being an architect working around the globe fascinating, that we're able to see a place with a fresh set of eyes, almost as if a child would see it, and become enamored with things that people perhaps take for granted. So I think that's a strong point of our philosophy as a firm.
So what have you got on the boards now? What are some of the buildings that are going to be coming out in 2024 and 2025?
Well, you know, we're looking forward to the completion of some of our first projects in Saudi Arabia. We started early on there. We have this resort that is carved out of the rock. That was something that literally we spent days searching the desert to find the location, and we came across this very large rock, and I was like, oh, let's build the resort in there. I don't know if it was a hallucination after not having, you know, water and being out in the sun, but that's underway, and that's going to be something that, even though it was done 2,500 years ago by the Nabateans, it really hasn't been done since. So that's going to be really exciting.
What part of Saudi Arabia is going to be in?
It's off of the Red Sea.
Okay.
A couple hours north of Jeddah. So that's going to be just something that's going to blow my mind to see it completed finally after all these years. And certainly people who have the pleasure of staying there. So that's really exciting. We just finished a large office building in Atlanta that reconsiders how people can work in a more hospitality environment. So that is completed. We broke ground on another resort, a Six Senses resort in Saudi Arabia.
Oh, those are nice. Yeah.
Yeah, outside of Riyadh in the ancient center of Saudi Arabia. So that's another competition that we have won, and that broke ground in December.
You have an office in an unusual place in Basel, Switzerland. So how come? I mean, you have a lot of Swiss clients, or just like to go there because it's so beautiful?
Well, not that unusual for architects, because it's sort of the epicenter of architecture. Herzog de Meuron, the Pritzker Prize winning firm, is based there as amongst other prestigious firms working around the world. What happened was we had won the headquarters, the competition to design the headquarters of a very renowned landscape architect by the name of Enzo Anea. And as we were doing that, I reconnected with a university colleague, Beat Husler, who came to Cornell when I was there doing his master's degree. And I had asked him to help us implement the project outside of Zurich, on the far end of Lake Zurich. So that went really well. And little by little, we built up the office. And now we have 45 people there and working all around Europe.
What's on your bucket list, Chad? What houses do you want to go to that you haven't gotten to yet?
Well, I'm really intrigued to get to some of the Lochner houses. Been to the Sheets Goldstein house. Actually, Goldstein was there sunbathing, George, you're not going to believe this, with a reflector, you know, from the old days, you know, those reflectors.
Oh, yeah.
And he was there sitting on the porch of the LA sun with a reflector. We got to look around the house, and that was breathtaking. But, you know, I'd love to get over to Bob Hope's house in Palm Springs. I'd love to get over to the Arango house in Acapulco. So these are things that are certainly on my bucket list. And I did an incredible journey with my son a couple of years back. He must have been maybe 9 or 10. And we went from Falling Water to Taliesin and went to all the architecture in between. We saw a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright. We went to Oak Park. We did Mies van der Rohe. We studied, and it was a fascinating trip. Ending up in Taliesin East, we ran out of time, and it was fascinating.
So, Chad, how far is the apple going to fall from the tree in this case?
Well, I don't know. He was more interested in architecture pre-teenage years. He would actually hang out in the office pre-COVID, I would say, and just work with the team when he was like 8, 9 years old, sit with us and actually just literally be like an equal voice in conversations. It was actually pretty wild. I was like, oh, I guess I know who I'm going to be working for someday.
Exactly.
Teenage years distracted that focus a bit, but he's still very interested in design, and he has a internship this summer with Ensemble Studio, which is an incredible office out of Madrid.
Well, let's talk about villain lairs that aren't even real. Like the set from The Incredibles was based a lot on modernist architecture, right?
Definitely. And we got to work with Pixar and Disney to do the Toy Story Hotel in Shanghai. Interestingly enough, they don't really credit the architects who do the projects, but we ended up doing that. This is the first time it's been revealed, George, so you're getting some...
Okay, we're breaking the story here, folks.
We're breaking the story. So we did the Toy Story Hotel, but on the way to doing the Toy Story Hotel, that hotel at one point was a Wall-E and the Incredibles hotel. Oh. And we worked very closely with Pixar and their production design teams, at that point led by Ralph Eggleston, who unfortunately passed away. He was an incredible genius, responsible for much of the production and character design and architecture. And we got to work very closely with them and understand their influences and certainly the modernist architecture. But we ended up designing this hotel as a Wall-E and the Incredibles hotel. And it was one of the most wonderful experiences of my career. You know, there's a couple of those moments, and we actually, when we presented, we got a standing ovation from the entire Pixar team. And that was definitely one of our highlights of our career.
And when was that project completed?
I think it was completed about maybe 5 years ago.
Okay.
In Shanghai. It ended up turning into a Toy Story hotel because after we had done the design, we got approvals from Bob Iger. We even got approvals from Steve Jobs because he was the largest shareholder of Disney at the time. They came back and said, guys, we have a little issue. No one in China really knows much about Wall-E and the Incredibles, but they love Toy Story. So we ended up designing it as a Toy Story hotel. And what took us literally 18 months of concept design was done in about a month because it was a little easier. But we ended up getting really deep into Wall-E and the Incredibles, and it was a fascinating process.
Chad, thanks so much for talking with me. Now I know who to go to for my next evil lair.
Really a pleasure, George.
That was George with Chad Oppenheim. Long Beach architect Alan Pullman is principal at Studio 111, a firm dedicated to the vast complexities of solving problems in cities. Recent projects included West Harbor, a 42-acre project at the Port of Los Angeles, and Watts Works, a community that has turned 58 shipping containers into 24 studio apartments. George spoke with Alan Pullman via Zoom.
Before we start talking about architecture, Alan, tell me about your preferred martini.
Oh, it would be a gin martini, dry with 3 olives.
Okay. How do you prepare it?
Well, you have to get the martini and the glass and the gin really cold, so you keep them in the freezer.
Okay.
And then you use one of those glass stirrers with the ice, so it's not shaken, it's stirred. And it's always trial and error, I think. I've had some good ones and I've made some good ones. I've made some bad ones. The best one I had was in London at the L'Elite Hotel. And if you get the bartender column, he'll treat you right.
That is good to know. You know, I've noticed that the pendulum has swung, so to speak, from shaken to stirred in martinis, where James Bond had it the other way around.
Yeah, there's something smoother about the stirred, I think. It could be real or not, but I prefer to think that way.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of your projects. Tell me about West Harbor at the port. What kind of project is that?
The West Harbor it's a mile of waterfront in the LA port, which is one of the largest ports in the country. Years ago, the port had built a small attraction for folks to visit and have dinner or walk around. They created a promenade. It was called Ports a Call. It was a little kitschy, but it was very popular for many, many years. But it was very difficult to keep up with the times. It wasn't particularly very flexible. And so after a while, it had fallen into disuse, except for one incredibly successful restaurant called the San Pedro Fish Market, which has always been an institution in that area and one of the most successful restaurants in LA. We were approached by a developer who got the assignment to redo Ports a Call and the entire promenade for the port in conjunction with the port. And they chose us as the architect. And we've been working on that for several years. And it's really exciting to be able to welcome people back to this working harbor, this waterfront that's really energetic and interesting. It's not like a resort feeling. It's a working port, so it has a lot of energy. And the first phase should be opening in the spring sometime.
Oh, that's great. If you want to see where he's talking about, you can just type in Port of Los Angeles into Google, and you can see the main channel there that goes into the city. And if you go through that, you'll see this little area on the left. The San Pedro Fish Market pops up right as a restaurant. It's kind of a triangular shape of land.
Exactly. Yes, a triangle.
And how big a project is that? It seemed to be pretty sizable.
Yeah, well, it's a multi-phase project. So there's a new walkway promenade that was designed by James Corner Field Operations out of New York and San Francisco. They did a fantastic job and also worked a lot on the master planning of this site. So there'll be 3 or 4 phases. They'll include restaurants and cultural attractions, park space. There'll be a dog-friendly brewery. And there's also going to be a 6,500-seat amphitheater that will be run by Nederlander Corporation for events and concerts. So it's going to really be a fantastic destination for the people of Los Angeles and visitors to the city as well. It's near a cruise ship terminal, so it really will get a lot of attention from people going on cruises. It's really going to be a fantastic people place and a great example of, I think, placemaking that the city is doing.
And how will people get there? Is it hooked up to transit, or is there going to be a lot of parking, or how will that work?
There is a transit line. It's the Silver Line. It's a bus line that comes from downtown Los Angeles. So it doesn't have rail. It used to have rail. It was part of the old red car system. But people can also drive there. There will be plentiful parking, and there is parking in downtown San Pedro as well. So getting there is actually fairly straightforward. And you could also take a boat if you're coming from one of the other seaside destinations. There'll be water taxis that will service the port and the West Harbor as well. So that would be a really fun way to come.
Is that currently in place, the water taxis, or is that for the future? Because I'd never heard of that for LA.
Yeah, there are some water taxis that run, for instance, from Long Beach and from Redondo Beach. And they will be probably once the piers are all done, again, sometime in the spring or summer, and that water taxi service will start again.
That is really, really cool. Now, before you established your studio in 2000, what were you doing?
I was an architect working in Los Angeles. Originally, I'm from New York. I moved out here after graduating, after working in New York City for a few years. And I was bouncing around at different firms, doing mostly commercial architecture. And I started Studio 111 in the year 2000 because I felt like working nationally, as I was doing, was interesting, and the commercial work was interesting. But I was much more interested in working in a community where I had some roots and make some deeper connections. So I started 211 really with that purpose. And my focus was on repurposing existing streets, main streets, existing areas of development, rather than new development, really building on what we already had in the city. And I saw this trend towards resuming or reactivating city life as something I was deeply interested in. And my studio really was started with the idea of redevelopment.
And you're also doing a project to redesign LA's bus stops. What are you doing there?
So we're working with a consortium of different folks to come up with bus stops that provide shade for transit riders. So LA's hot, it's getting hotter. And a lot of the transit riders, a lot of the bus stops have no shelter whatsoever, no amenities whatsoever. Sometimes they don't even have a bench. So the challenge there is coming up with a bus stop, but it's really not a design challenge. And again, I mentioned this is a multi-team effort. SOM is on our team and BMW Design Works. And we've all worked together to come up with the design of this kit of parts for bus shelters. But the real challenge is actually implementing and getting them built. So we're really at the forefront of the team, helping select the sites and judging if the site will actually be a good site for a bus shelter location, and then actually documenting the existing conditions and the new bus shelter requirements to put them in place. It's really an implementation issue. That's what stopped the shelters before. But I'm glad to say that our first shelters have been placed and the program is moving forward. The goal is to put in 3,000 new bus shelters in the next 10 years. And we're on our way to trying to meet that goal. It's ambitious, but I think it could be done. And it's been really a challenging project, but one that I think will deliver results for the people of the city.
So is the biggest difference in these new shelters just the fact that there's shade overhead?
Well, that's a big part of it. There's shade, there's information kiosks where you get real-time information about when the bus will be coming. It has some advertising revenue, but it also will have abilities to put in art to really make a connection to the neighborhood. LA is incredibly diverse with so many different types of neighborhoods. So there's ways of actually making it enhance the streetscape and create a sense of community in some of the places that we're putting these shelters.
Well, Alan, one of the reasons that I heard about you and wanted to invite you on the show was the fact that you own a Soriano house in Long Beach.
I do. I've owned it for about 12 years.
This is the Kempson-Nixon house in Long Beach, which, according to our research, says Soriano drew this house during a 6-month stay in the hospital after being hit by a car. That's a great origin story.
Yeah, it's interesting. And George, I actually have a picture. It's a construction shot of foundations with the Kempsons and actually Gladys Nixon, who also owned the house. And they're sitting there with Rafael Soriano on a foundation, and he has a cane in his hand. And I think he has the cane in hand because he was recovering from this automobile accident that he had.
Yeah. And of course, you know, being an architect, you've done a lot of restoration on the house. Tell me about how that's gone.
Well, I bought the house 12 years ago, and it's very prosaic. And I have 3 daughters. One had already gone to college, but my other 2 daughters are twins, and we're getting older. And I was living in a very classic California bungalow here in Long Beach. It was a great house, but it only had 1 bathroom. And my wife was like, we need to have another bathroom with all of us here.
Sure.
Also, a bungalow is a wonderful kind of house to live in, and I really enjoyed it. It was a classic California craftsman bungalow. But one of the things I realized about a bungalow is it's a very much a enveloping cocoon-like feeling, and I like that. But I came from New York where moving to California, I really want to experience that indoor-outdoor lifestyle. And bungalows generally, especially an old one like this, built in 1913, it wasn't about the indoor-outdoor lifestyle. In fact, to get outside from the back, you had to go through a laundry room and through a little hallway. So it almost had no connection to the backyard. So I thought about renovating it and remodeling it. And as I was doing that, though, my wife mentioned to me this house that I had mentioned when riding by it one day, saying, I'd love to live in that house. She saw that it was on the market. And so she called me one day and she said, you know, that house of yours is on the market. I didn't know what she was talking about. But I said, oh, go check it out, see what's happening there, because I was at work. And within a few days, we had placed an offer on the house, and within a few weeks, we were living in the house. So it was an amazing story, so random in a lot of ways. Yet I guess I had somehow put it out there in the universe that I wanted to live in the house, and my wish came true. So that was 12 years ago, and it was fantastic at the house, but it was in not very good shape. I guess that's one of the reasons I was able to buy it. It was actually in terrible shape. And I realized I would have a multi-year renovation to actually make it something that I could show off and be proud of.
So what have you had to do to the house over the last 12 years?
There were several stages of the renovation. One of them is to make it livable. The kitchen hadn't been used in many, many years, and the appliances were all very, very old from the 1950s, and none of them were operational. No one had lived upstairs in many years, so the wallpaper was peeling, and the bathrooms were in terrible shape. Gladys Nixon, who had lived in the house for something like 60 plus years and was infirm and living in a hospital bed on the ground floor, and nurses would come in to feed her and take care of her. So the house was in poor living condition. The other thing that happened is it's a Soriano house that looks like it might be metal, but it's actually wood painted with aluminum paint, as Soriano learned from Neutra. But the wood hadn't been taken care of. The house probably hadn't been termited in many, many decades. And a lot of the wood had termite damage, which let water into the house, into the walls. So all of the beautiful wood paneling, which was one of my favorite parts of the living room, was delaminating and falling apart. So there was a lot of issues that I had to go through. I had to do it on a tight budget. I didn't have much money. So my first step was to just make it livable, rip off wallpaper, repaint, repatch, stucco, and then the kitchen. The original location of the kitchen was in one room, and sometime in the 1950s, the kitchen was moved into a different room. Not sure why.
Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah, I think the thinking was probably in the 1950s. The house was built in the late 30s. In the 1950s, probably the idea of having a formal dining room was very much au courant, and people need to have a formal dining room. So they moved the kitchen into a back bedroom, and they made this, what was the kitchen space, into a dining room, because there was a dining room table when I moved in there. I didn't like this setup at all. I didn't want a formal dining room. I didn't think it was a good room for a formal dining room. The windows weren't correct. So what I did is I disassembled the kitchen. The kitchen that was built in the 50s was a modular metal, steel, enamel kitchen with cabinets. I disassembled them and I moved them back into the original location. And then I moved the dining room back to where it was, sort of part of a great living room. So that was the big move I made back when I bought it. I wasn't sure I could do it in the budget and time I had, but I realized if I didn't do it, I'd really regret not doing it. So that was one of the big pieces of work that I did right when I moved in.
Have you worked on renovating other modernist houses since this project?
No, we do very modern buildings, but we don't do houses. That's one area of work that we don't do. So it was a learning curve for me, finding the right tradespeople, the right people that really knew how to take care of a house. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy, but I was diligent about trying to do it the right way. So after I moved the kitchen, though, other things I did were landscape projects to really reclaim the backyard, which had become a bit of a jungle. I also decided that I need to put in air conditioning, and that took me a while to figure out how to do that because the house didn't have air conditioning, but it's a lot of windows with a lot of Western exposure. So figuring out how to do that and keeping it as minimal and unobtrusive as possible was really critical.
So I have to ask, how did you do it? Did you hide it in the roof or in the closet somewhere, or how did you hide all the equipment?
Yeah, I created several different zones. So the downstairs, I was able to use the forced air system to add an air conditioning unit and an outdoor hidden condenser to cool the ground floor. Upstairs was a little more challenging. And what I did is I used a series of mini split systems and figure out a creative way to run the piping so you would not see it from the outside or the inside into these different rooms I had to cool. It's really only 2 bedrooms, so it wasn't that challenging, but I had to really think hard about it because no air conditioning consultant really could figure it out for me. I eventually figured it out myself and was able to find somebody to implement my plan.
And how big are mini split systems? I know they're new for most people, at least on the East Coast.
They're about 3 feet long and about 18 inches high. And I put them into the closet, and they're small little units, and they run by having the condensing pipes, come in through the walls, and they have to have drainage. So there's a little bit of work to them, but they're a pretty effective way of cooling and heating a house. I also have a heat pump that cools and heats the rooms. I think it's efficient because you really have zones that you could control separately. And I'm really happy with the way that they came out. So highly recommend looking into heat pumps and mini splits for unobtrusive, ductless way of cooling a house.
Now, Alan, your firm is very dedicated to sustainability and to committing to being zero carbon in your designs by 2030. So what's the biggest challenge to doing that?
There's several challenges, but I would talk about maybe what the opportunities are. So in California, we've really devoted ourselves to doing all electric buildings. All electric buildings mean there's no internal combustion. So there's no gas furnace, there's no gas water heater, and there's no gas appliances. And that's one way to get towards net zero. We've just done a project that will be net zero, and not only will be net zero, but it'll also pull no power off the grid between 4 p.m. and 9 p.m., which is the peak time that homes are pulling energy off the grid. And it's being done with a very vast array of solar panels. And also just making sure that the windows are organized so that they limit solar heat gain and that we're using high insulation values. So there's a lot of things that we can do. Mm-hmm. This project that I just talked about won an innovation grant from the state utility company. So it will be moving forward, and it'll be a great example of how to not only make a net zero project, but one that really reduces its reliance on the electrical grid.
Alan, thank you so much for spending a little time with me, and I'm very envious of your Soriano house. I'm seeing a lot of photos of it on the internet. It looks gorgeous.
Thank you. It's been a labor of love, but I've loved living in it, and it's taught me a lot about how to design a wonderful house and live in it. And really, the lessons of that house have definitely impacted the work we do in our other commercial projects.
You can see Alan's work at studio-111.com, and you can see all of Soriano's houses at usmodernist.org/Soriano. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you, George.
We were talking to Long Beach's Alan Pullman. David Peterson has an MBA from NYU.
Go Violets.
And he worked in investment banking at companies like Citibank and Salomon Brothers. Now he's the founder of the Onera Foundation to engage the public about historic preservation and significance through advocacy, exhibitions, grants, and publications. And David is the author of the great new book, U.S. Embassies of the Cold War, The Architecture of Democracy, Diplomacy, and Defense. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
David, I noticed there aren't many MBAs and investment bankers going into preservation. So what is your story here?
Well, I also have a master's from Columbia in historic preservation. So those two are pretty rare together. It probably means I'm got a little dyslexia or something like that. I go in a lot of different directions. The real story is I was fortunate enough to put a little bit of money away, having worked in the financial business for a while. And you get to a certain age and you kind of say to yourself, what do you really want to do with your life? And believe it or not, I applied to Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, and I was accepted, and I graduated in 2018.
Wow. So oldest student ever?
I was twice as old as the oldest student in the class.
Okay.
It was a pioneering effort. It's probably the scariest things I've ever done because the kids in the class were a lot smarter than I was, but I managed to graduate and do my thesis. And that's how this book came about, because my thesis was about Cold War embassies.
Your website for Onera says that you're trying to challenge conventional perspectives on preservation. So let's start with that. What are the conventional perspectives on preservation?
Well, to put it bluntly, there's a sense that preservationists have that everything should be saved. And if you take that attitude, then it becomes very challenging because obviously everything can't be saved. And buildings or sites that, quote, have significance, either historical, architectural, or design and so forth, those are the buildings to be saved. And if you want to be on the National Register, it's got to be historical, cultural, or architectural. But Not every building can be saved just simply because it's old. It's a question of trying to identify those buildings and sites that have significance. And that's a bit of a challenge.
I give you a 2 hallelujah on that one, David. That's a great one because I agree with that completely. If you try to save everything, you just spread your resources too thin too.
Well, and it also dilutes the efforts of preservationists who are often perceived as advocating for buildings and sites that are unreasonable. It's better to save your dry powder or whatever you want to call it for those places and those sites that really can make a difference if you save them. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is because it's a form of preservation advocacy to highlight these buildings and these embassies that are quickly disappearing because they were built in an era to be open and honest and transparent to try to reflect the America in the 1950s. But because they were built to be open and accessible, they can't be protected adequately. And London's a good example. Saren's beautiful building in London was sold a number of years ago because it couldn't be adequately protected in the dense urban environment. It had bollards, it had guard posts, streets were shut down, neighbors were going crazy. And it was sold, unfortunately, to an investment firm that, in my opinion, did not do a great job with a grade 2 building. They left 3 facades. And we all know about what is called facadism in England. And that is that preservation somehow is okay if you save the facade only.
Did they tear down the rest of it?
The whole interior is gone. Everything's gone. I will tell you an embarrassing story. It's about 3 years ago. I went to London and was staying around the corner and walked by Grosvenor Square. And I thought it was a grade 2 building. I should have known better, but I thought a building couldn't be gutted the way they gutted it. And I was walking down the street and I looked up and it was only 3 facades. It looked like it had been bombed. And I had tears streaming down my eyes. I mean, I'm passionate about these embassies. These are American assets. I was walking slowly down one of the side streets on Grosvenor Square, and a doorman came up and said, "Are you okay?" And he put his arm around me.
Oh, really?
And I said, "I'm an American. What did they do to our building?" And he said, "I know, they ruined it."
Oh, this is the first I've heard of that. I'm just gutted.
Oh, yeah, it's really unfortunate.
Facadism? That's the term.
Yeah, it's what they've done here in Durham, where they tore down this beautiful tobacco warehouse but left one wall as some sort of monument to the old building, which means nothing eventually.
Yeah. I mean, the part that is never coming back is the smell of the tobacco.
Yeah.
Speaking as a kid who went to Durham High School.
And the structure of the whole thing and the experience of it. David, let's take us back in time here. So why were these beautiful modernist buildings commissioned in the first place? Why did America embark on this 25-year journey of spreading the gospel of modernism to other countries?
It's a good question. It was really an all-out effort to combat communism and to build a reputation for America being progressive, open, and a creative nation. We did a number of things after World War II to combat communism and try to contain communism. There was George Kennan's famous long telegram in 1946. But we realized that the Soviet Union's intentions were to expand. And so it was expansion versus containment. So how do you contain communism as a big country like America? Well, we built up our military. We had, in 1950, we had roughly 300 nuclear warheads. By 1960, we had almost 20,000 warheads, nuclear warheads.
Holy cow, I didn't know that.
What else did we do? We started the intelligence agency. We started the CIA in 1947 to gather intelligence outside of America. Many know, but the CIA operates outside the U.S. The FBI operates inside the U.S. So we started the CIA in 1947 to gather information, smart, about what our adversaries are doing. Third thing we did was to start the U.S. Information Agency. And what did the U.S. Information Agency do? They tried to convince hearts and minds around the world about the benefit of democracy. But what did that really mean? At the time, early 1950s, they were the largest publisher in the world. 47 magazines, almost 50 newspapers around the world. They had Voice of America, was the largest broadcaster in the world. So we were making a very conscious effort. It was called cultural diplomacy, sometimes called soft power, to help convince hearts and minds around the world about the benefits of democracy. And so the embassies were just a physical form of that cultural diplomacy. Obviously, there were ambassadors and diplomacy going on in the embassies, but as many people don't know, the U.S. Information Agency had theaters art exhibitions and libraries inside the embassies so that foreigners could come to the embassies and try to experience what it was like to live in America.
So it was really like a small expo as well as offices for the government.
Yeah, it was really an American cultural center. In the library in Seren's beautiful building in London, there were over 100,000 visitors a year just to the library.
It was as if there was a world fair and each embassy was like a U.S. pavilion in that city.
Exactly right. The World's Fair exhibitions, the one in 1958 in Brussels, to be specific, Edward Durrell Stone had almost an identical building to his very famous New Delhi embassy, except his was circular. The World's Fairs were a billboard for the propaganda, not that that's a negative word, but the propaganda about who was fighting for whom and democracy versus communism.
Now, I know these embassies, any embassy is going to have security for itself. But over time, when did the security issue get so big that they couldn't have people visiting like the 100,000 people to the library anymore?
Well, there are no more libraries and exhibitions of any consequence or auditoriums in the embassies anymore. They were called Kembaum and Tanbaum, but in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, there were simultaneous terrorist bombs that blew up both the U.S. embassies. That changed the dynamic forever. And then
that was traced to Al-Qaeda, wasn't it?
It was. And it was the largest FBI investigation in the history of the agency. And you say, as I just said before, the FBI doesn't operate outside the U.S.
Right.
Well, they do because land owned by the United States government in a foreign country is considered U.S. soil. So the U.S. conducted that major investigation by the FBI. And then obviously 9/11 happened not a few years later. And everything changed. Security became the primary focus of every embassy. And what did we do? We decided to build, they're called bunker embassies, but they essentially look like prisons. High-walled buildings on multi-acre plots of land with blast-proof windows. But it was an effort to provide the best security possible. And you can't blame the State Department for doing it.
Of course not.
You've got to protect your diplomats and people working in the embassies. The good news is we are now pivoting. Genie Gang's doing a great, beautiful new embassy in Brasilia, and some other great architects are building much more aesthetically, architecturally focused embassies. And we recently realized that you can build security and a good-looking building at the same time.
Did people always live at the embassy? Because I know in recent decades, the government has built more and more residential facilities so that all their key staff can stay on board. But I understand that in the early days, that wasn't true. They lived all around town.
Yeah, I mean, the embassies before the end of World War II were pretty haphazard. I mean, we had a big embassy in London and Paris and a couple of the major cities in Europe, but many of them were bombed out during the war. But often in other cities, they were rented space above a car garage, or they had diplomatic efforts within a residence. So there were no formal embassies. But it wasn't really until after World War II that we went on this major embassy building program.
Is the reverse true, David, about other countries' embassies in the U.S.? For example, a couple of years ago, I went to the Finnish embassy in Washington, D.C., and it's a gorgeous, gorgeous building. And it was much as you described. It was an open space. If there was security features there, you couldn't really tell. And it was for an event that was open to the public. And all around was all this great propaganda, again, in the best sense, about what a fabulous country Finland is. Mm-hmm. So do other countries still do that here on our soil?
Well, obviously, just so listeners know the difference, embassies, at least by U.S. standards, embassies are built in the capitals of countries. The consulates are in major cities, but not capital cities. So there's a difference between a consulate and the embassy. Foreign countries have done a fair amount of quality building of their embassies, particularly those countries that understand the message that is sent by good architecture. We laugh about it, but one of my favorite embassies is the U.S. Embassy in Havana that's had so much controversy around it. When it was finally built in the mid-1950s by Harrison and Abramowitz, who were the designers of the CIA building in Langley. No coincidence, I'm sure. Batista was overthrown by Castro in 1960, and the embassy was operated by the Swiss government for many, many years.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. It's actually flew the Swiss flag outside the U.S. Embassy down there. I was fortunate enough to go down and see the embassy a few years ago, and it sits on a very prominent part of Cuba. Unfortunately, when it was built, it was one of the early buildings to have central air conditioning, but designers didn't really understand the tropical environment and the glass warmth effect, and it had to be augmented and did not perform very well.
In your book, you go through a variety of gorgeous buildings by various architects. What are some of your favorites that you chronicled?
Well, it's a little bit like your children or your vintage cars or whatever. They're all your favorites. I actually taught a class up at a school up in Harlem last week. And I said it's like the all-star team for the NBA. The foreign building office at the State Department decided, okay, we're just going to call up and contact the best architects in the world. And it was Walter Gropius, who started the Bauhaus in 1919, shut down by the Nazis in 1933. It was Eero Saarinen. It was Edward Durell Stone. I mean, it was pre-Starchitect days, but these were the best and the brightest. And many of them were immigrants that left Europe to flee after the war. So a fascinating kind of turn of events. And in fact, when Gropius built the Athens embassy, he used the same Pentelic marble that was built in the Parthenon. Interesting that the State Department chose Gropius, who basically stuck his finger out at the Nazis after he came to this country. But if you were going to pick one place in the world that was kind of the foundation for Western democracy, it would be Athens and it would be Greece.
Sure.
I don't think it's a coincidence that the U.S. chose Walter Gropius, who was forced to flee the Nazis, to build that embassy. So there's so many stories about who decided to build these things. I said about Cuba, that was built by Harrison Abramovitz, who also built the embassy in Rio. It's now a consulate because the
capital got moved.
The capital got moved, as you know, good for you. But each one of these embassies has a great story. So I love them all. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is to try to highlight how great these embassies are.
One of the stories I remember is about the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, which I can't remember who designed it, but for some reason, I believe it was built by the Russians, and they filled it with intelligence gathering things like in the walls that eventually got discovered, and they had to move out and build another one. Is that how it went?
Yep,
they actually
right.
tore it down. Yeah, I mean, I don't know who the genius was decided to allow the Soviets to construct it. But
I think it was a condition of it being built.
Somebody was probably
place.
stoned, but whatever. I actually highlighted in my book the Soviet Union gave a carved plaque, a symbol of America. It was the eagle and probably 3 feet wide. And the ambassador put it behind his chair in his office. And by the way, it was a thank you to America for helping during World War II. 10 or 15 years later, they were just kind of dusting up the place. And of course, how many bugs did they find in that plaque? So they were eavesdropping the whole. They did it on purpose.
Yeah, sure.
It was like a Trojan horse.
And the whole building, I think, was full of them.
Oh, yeah. They had to tear down the building and rebuild it.
Right.
If you look at the U.S. Embassy in Havana versus the Soviet Embassy in Havana, it's about as stark a comparison as you can possibly make. So the U.S. Embassy is a lot of glass. It's got rectilinear. It's straight lines everywhere, lack of ornamentation, all that kind of stuff. The Soviet Embassy looks like a 200-foot tall listening post. It looks like it's very threatening.
So it has a little antenna farm on the roof?
It really looks like a control tower in an airport, but a very tall, brutalist tower. So
subtle.
You mentioned that Jeannie Gang is doing a new embassy in Brasilia. What are some of the new embassies that are coming along that are turning the tide of design?
Well, you've got Kieran Timberlake's, they call it the Ice Cube in London, that replaced Saarinen's embassy. Another one in Malawi. They're what architecture world is called much more contextual. So local materials, reflective of local designs. They're not building international style embassies anymore, but they are trying to reflect and be contextual in the architecture that they're building. And instead of building those bunker embassies that they built after 1998 and 9/11, they're building much more attractive, much more open, much more aesthetic buildings. And it's a real effort by the State Department. So I tip my hat to them, because embassies are a billboard. They're a physical billboard of America. And now we're getting back to a place where you look at a U.S. embassy and you go, oh, okay, this may be a country I want to go visit because it's progressive and open and interesting.
Last question, David. So in all the movies, when they have a party at somebody's embassy and the women are dressed up and the men are in tuxes, right? It seems ridiculously easy for someone to walk up the stairs and steal something from an office. Are they still having parties like that in the embassy, or is that kind of gone the way of the dodo as well?
Well, it's kind of gone the way of the auditorium and the library and so forth. I mean, obviously there are events. They're typically exhibitions, art exhibitions or art related. The ambassador's residences often have events. In fact, Jane Hartley is the ambassador in London, and she's got this spectacular place in London that's on 16 acres in London. It's one of the largest private parks in London. It's very, very cool. But yeah, they can continue to do events. But you're not going to just walk up the steps and wander into the embassy. I mean, you could try. I wouldn't recommend it, but.
The book is U.S. Embassies of the Cold War, The Architecture of Democracy, Diplomacy, and Defense. Thanks so much for talking with us, David.
My pleasure.
We were chatting with David Peterson. Returning musical guest Halie Loren is a singer-songwriter who started her career with a bang by winning a songwriting contest at age 13. By the time she turned 17, she was in Nashville and recorded her first album at the age of 20. Halie has had several #1 songs on the Canadian and Japanese jazz charts, and her jazz debut album, They Ought to Write a Song, won Best Vocal Jazz Album of the Year in Japan. Her latest album is Dreams Lost and Found. Here's George's unashamed fanboy conversation with Halie Loren.
Halie, you started your career winning a songwriting contest very young, like 12 or 13, right?
13-ish, I guess.
13-ish?
I don't remember that well. I might have been 13 or 14. I don't know.
Well, close enough.
I started writing songs when I was 13, though, so it definitely was around that time.
Do you remember what was the song?
Oh, gosh. Well, I entered a lot of contests that year, and I won several of them. So I think it might have been a song of mine called Flow, River, Flow, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't know for sure. Again, my memory, it's been a long time. I think that there were 3 or 4 songs of mine that placed in some songwriting competitions that same year, which was crazy.
When you enter a songwriting contest, do you just submit the music and lyrics, or do you perform it and send a video? How does it work?
In those days, you would send the lyrics and then you would send a recording, a demo recording.
Okay.
So in my case, it was, like a guitar and a vocal or a piano and a vocal. But nowadays, it might be a video. I don't really know how it works. I haven't entered a songwriting competition in a really long time. But
well, your career has just gone up and up and up and up. And your latest album is very swoon-worthy.
Oh, thank you.
I remember last time I was swooning when we had both Bjarke Ingels and you on the same show.
I remember. I remember that.
And this album is really very swoon-worthy. You recorded it in Montreal, right?
I did. I recorded it in Montreal. It was with a group of musicians who live in Montreal that I've been playing with. Most of them I've been playing with for years now. Most of the people who were involved were fellow artists who were part of the Just in Time Records label, which also distributed and distributes my albums.
Yes.
It was a collaboration with some people that I've long loved to make music with, and this was our chance to finally get in the studio together for the first time. So that was really nice.
This next song is from the 1945 film State Fair, written by Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein II. It's sung early in the film by Margie, the teenage daughter of the State Fair-bound Frake family, who is feeling the symptoms of spring fever. This all from Wikipedia. But the movie version is not nearly as great as what you're about to hear. So here's Halie with It Might As Well Be Spring.
I'm as restless as a willow in a windstorm. I'm as jumpy as a puppet on a string. Oh, why should I have spring fever when it isn't even spring? I'm starry-eyed and vaguely discontented, like a nightingale without a song to sing. Oh, why should I have spring fever when it isn't even spring? I keep wishing I were somewhere else and walking down a strange new street and hearing words that I've never heard from a man that I've yet to meet. Wishing I were somewhere else, walking down a strange new street and hearing words that I have never heard from a man I've yet to meet. I'm busy as a spider spinning daydreams. I'm as giddy as a baby on a swing. Oh, I haven't seen a crocus or a rosebud or a robin anywhere on the wing. Oh, but I feel so gay in that melancholy way that it might as well be spring. Oh, it might as well be. It might as well be spring.
Halie, who were some of the musicians on that track?
That was Tori Butler on piano, Morgan Moore on the bass, who also co-produced the album with me, and Sam Kermeyer on guitar.
What a great group.
So great. So great. The album rounds out with drums by Jim Doxis, but not all of the tracks have drums. It's just a few of them.
This past summer, you went to Japan for a multi-date gig. What prompted you to make that kind of booking?
Well, I've been to Japan many times as a performer. I think this was my 10th tour there.
Holy cow. Okay.
So I know. Spent more time there than most places in the world. But my album was also released when it was released on Just in Time Records from Canada to the rest of the world. In Asia, my album is released by JVC Kenwood / Victor Entertainment, and they have released all of my previous albums as well. I have a really lovely, wonderful, following of tons of fans in Japan that I just get to keep coming back to tour there because they keep asking me to come back, and I'm happy to oblige. I love going there. And the Cotton Club in Tokyo is the place that I probably played the most often of anywhere in the world besides, venues locally. As I was growing up, I probably played those just as many times, but over the course of many more years. But Cotton Club Tokyo is just a world-class venue. As a musician, it's such a treat to go and play in a place like that for audiences who will listen so carefully. It's a stunning experience.
Well, I'm hoping to go to Tokyo in 2025, so I'm going to look the Cotton Club up.
Oh, you'll love it. You will love it.
We didn't talk about this last time, but in addition to singing and making people like me swoon across the world, you're also a visual artist. What have you been working on lately?
Man, most of my visual artistry goes into digital design work these days. Designing my album covers, for example.
Okay.
I've designed all of my own album covers. I do a lot of my own graphics for other things too. I dabble in other things as well, just for my own personal enjoyment. I like to do pastels and charcoal work particularly.
Mm-hmm.
but it's more of sort of a side hobby for me at this point in my life. Earlier in my life, it was almost on par with music and how involved I was with it, but it's been a while since I've been able to dedicate that much time to it.
Something to relax, right?
Yeah, to relax, express myself. I tend to take a little sketchbook with me on vacation, for example, and just sort of sketch out random ideas. I used to take it a lot more seriously, but now I just let myself play. And that's nice to be able to do that and kind of separate my creativity from being production oriented, which is, you kind of get caught in that trap sometimes as somebody who makes art for a living, trying to separate your creativity from your commercial productivity. And it's nice to be able to just be able to separate the two completely in one area of your life.
You would enjoy our architecture tours because we always had people there sketching buildings.
I bet I would like that.
Well, we're going to have to make that happen at some point.
Well, count me in.
This next song, I'll Be Seeing You, is a very popular song written by Sammy Fain and lyrics by Irving Kahal. It was published in 1938. It's been recorded by any number of performers, particularly those that were very big in the 50s and 60s, being Crosby, Frank Sinatra, Tommy Dorsey, and even Brenda Lee, who's been on our show before.
Oh, wow.
Recorded the song as the final track of her 1962 album, Sincerely Brenda Lee. Here's Halie with I'll Be Seeing You.
Be seeing you in all the old familiar places. This heart of mine embraces all day through. Small cafe in the park across the way, the children's carousel, the chestnut tree in the wishing well. I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's bright and gay. I'll always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing you.
Halie, your new album is Dreams Lost and Found. Where can people get that the easiest? Is it streaming somewhere? Do they buy it online? How does it work?
All of the above.
Okay.
It is streaming everywhere that you can find music streaming all around the world. And it's also available on any major online retailer. My personal favorite is through Bandcamp, just because it's it's run by the artists or
Oh, yes.
sometimes by indie labels. But I run my Bandcamp page, my team and I run it personally. So it's the most direct way to get music from me and from many other artists as well. So I'm on Bandcamp at halieloren.bandcamp.com. And the album, of course, is on there for either download or you can get a CD if you're still buying CDs.
Oh, sure.
I know a lot of people aren't these days.
We've got some old tech around the house. We can put that in.
Yeah.
I mean, vinyl is coming back in a big way, right?
That's what I hear. This one is not out on vinyl. I hope that it will be.
I hope so too.
Yeah, I get a lot of requests about that.
The new album is Dreams Lost and Found, and Halie will be also appearing in British Columbia and also in Delray Beach, Florida, as well as many other places. It's Halie Loren, pronounced like Sophia. Thank you so much for joining me, Halie.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 21,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Shelby Hockenberry and Carrie Cesarino handled guest research. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another On the Road Again edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.
TikTok people, get your ass on the phone and call those senior architects now. Send us your recordings, and we might feature your interview on the show. George at usmodernist.org.